Good day and welcome to the first TAACCCT evaluation webinar of 2015, Adapting Evaluation Designs to Reality. I'm Randy Wilson at Jobs for the Future, and we'll be moving on to the webinar momentarily, but first my colleague Dudney Silla of JFF is going to give you a technical overview of the webinar. Dudney?
Hello everyone, thank you once again for joining us for today's webinar. We're really excited to host you all today. Just a couple of notes before we get started regarding the technology. What we're asking is for everyone who's joining us today is if you can please mute your phones. We'll also mute everything on our end as well, but this will just help to limit the background noise as we have our speakers lead the way today. This roundtable is being recorded as well, and we're going to make the recording available after the webinar for you and your colleagues to view down the line as well. If you run into any technical glitches, you can email me based on the email I sent out in the invitation, or you can call WebEx technical support at 1-866-229-3239, and they can support you with any technical issues in the background. For today's webinar, what we're also asking is, our presenters will be providing content throughout the webinar today. If you have questions or comments, please use the chat box on the bottom right of your screen. That's where we'll be fielding all of your questions, and then we'll be saying the questions out loud throughout the webinar and also during the question and answer session right after our presenters are finished. Thank you. Randy?
Thank you, Dudney. And I want to welcome everybody again, particularly those of you who may be joining for the first time to the TAACCCT learning community peer learning event. Also to those of you who are rejoining us from prior years, welcome. And I think this topic will be very relevant to everyone today. It's kind of an evergreen that what you plan to do in an evaluation often runs into significant challenges in reality. That's our title, Adapting Evaluation Designs to Reality. Our starting point here is that the objective for all of us is to get the highest possible rigor in terms of the impact and the analysis of our TAACCCT programs. But oftentimes, because these programs are implemented and evaluated in a very complex and changing environment, things don't always work out exactly as you plan. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because a lot of the learning, both in programs and in the craft of evaluation, come, we believe, in adapting to the context of evaluations. Adjustments are inevitable, so we want to determine, based on the practical experience of some of our evaluators in the community, what practical experience they can offer to both adapt to the process, adapt to challenges in the environment to get the best and most rigorous evaluation possible, but also to anticipate particular challenges and work formatively with evaluators, with colleges, including institutional researchers and other stakeholders in the program to obtain the best data possible. So today we're going to hear from two evaluation teams. The first is Paul Bucci and Doug Evans from Paul T. Bucci and Associates. Dr. Bucci has been an evaluator in higher education programs since 1979, and his associate, he is the president of Paul T. Bucci Associates. His associate, Douglas Evans, comes from George Washington University and previously from RTI Incorporated. Following them, we're going to hear from Dr. Heath Prince, who's the executive director of the Ray Marshall Center at the University of Texas Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, and he and his associates are also evaluators of several TAACCCT programs. So after we hear from our presenters, we're going to leave the maximum time possible for your discussions and your questions and answers. So stand by. As Dudney said, mute your phone. We're going to hear now from Paul Bucci and Doug Evans. Okay? Turning over to you, Paul.
Hello, Paul Bucci here. Let's go to the next slide, please, Dudney. Just wanted to give you a little bit of background about PTB and Associates. We are a Bethesda, Maryland-based consulting group founded in 2009, and we have been working for a number of clients, 18 college and university clients currently, and focusing in particular on conducting large-scale, multi-site intervention research studies and program evaluation projects using quasi-experimental designs and methods. And Doug Evans, our chief scientist, leads that area. We currently are working on 4 TAACCCT consortium evaluations, one in Illinois, focused on manufacturing, another in Alabama, Florida, focusing on welding and electronics. Those are round 2 grantees. And then recently, 2 new round 4 grantees, one in Minnesota, focusing on advanced manufacturing, and then North Dakota, focusing on energy and transportation and construction. And Doug's going to give you an overview of our flexible approach to applying the most rigorous possible evaluation on these projects. Doug?
Thanks very much, Paul and Dudney and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Doug Evans, and you heard the introduction earlier. In my capacity working with PTB Associates, I'm the lead evaluator, lead methodologist for our projects, and Paul mentioned the 4 that we're working on right now. This slide basically just gives you an overview of our general approach to evaluating TAACCCT and other programs. And the basic idea is that we're starting, for our default position is that we're trying to design the most rigorous evaluation possible given the circumstances on the ground. And in the introduction, you heard some, I think, very pertinent comments about the typical situations that we encounter in TAACCCT and other program evaluations, similar evaluations, and I think the examples I'm going to give you bear that out for sure. Typically, we start from a hypothesis that we're expecting that the enrolled participants in these programs, for example, the 4 that Paul mentioned a minute ago, will demonstrate education and employment outcomes at higher levels than matched comparison non-participants. So the question is, how do we actually create those comparison groups? Like you, many of you I know are evaluators. I'm sure that you realize that it's typically not possible and generally not desirable, in fact, to create randomized studies in these instances. And so the best kind of approach that we can use is a rigorous quasi-experimental design. And I think also, like many of you, we try to create match comparison groups. So we use propensity score matching as our default approach. The challenge then is, how do you go about constructing that comparison group? We typically also use both qualitative and quantitative designs. We like to supplement the quantitative data that we're able to gather on students through the colleges and through institutional data sources with qualitative data in the form of in-depth interviews with stakeholders, focus groups with students and faculty and other stakeholders at the colleges in order to be able to interpret the quantitative results and to triangulate on outcomes. So we typically use both qualitative and quantitative methods. And typically what we're trying to do is look both at participant and comparison groups in order to be able to identify differential outcomes as stated in the hypothesis on this slide. So, and in doing the analysis of those outcomes, we're using multivariate models, typically regression models, multivariable regression models in order to evaluate the effects of the program on participant outcomes. So what that usually entails is identifying a source of comparison data and that's usually part of our initial conversations with colleges. Where are those comparison data going to come from? We know where the participant data are going to come from. They're going to come prospectively through the enrollment over time of students in the grant-funded program. Now, sometimes defining exactly what the intervention, what the grant-funded period of interest is, can be something that requires some thought and some design work, and I'll mention that a little bit more in just a second. But usually the big conversation that we have up front with the colleges that we're working with on evaluations, and that's obviously a partnership arrangement. We're working in collaboration with them. They are partners in that endeavor. It's not a one-way street. It's a two-way collaborative relationship. Is really to identify, what is the best source of comparison data that we can feasibly access and have sufficient data, both in terms of numbers, because for propensity score matching you need approximately equal size groups to make a valid comparison, and also sufficient data on those comparison students in order to be able to construct the PSM models. So those are kind of the issues that we usually end up discussing early on with our clients. And so why don't we go to the next slide? And what I'm going to do is just go through a few kind of real examples in the spirit of this webinar on evaluation designs in the real world, and just talk about some of the challenges that we have typically encountered in this. One challenge is in the area of tracking students. So obviously, if we're trying to examine the effects of the implementation of a grant program over time, we're going to need to be able to follow in various ways student progress. So one issue that often arises here is collecting valid exit data. So it's not unusual, and I'm sure all of you have experienced these kinds of things in TAACCCT grants, for students to not necessarily complete the full program of study. These are not traditional students. Typically, they're not necessarily matriculating through a 2- or a 4-year program with the main goal being to complete the degree or the credential. Often the goal is simply to get sufficient education to become employed or to get a promotion or a raise. And so it's not unusual for students to depart prior to their completion of the degree. So how do you collect valid exit data? Well, that is a challenge that we've addressed, and we've developed exit surveys, and we've also developed techniques for collecting data, being able to follow students, having follow-up data that allows us to recontact them in the future. It can often be difficult to collect UIA or Unemployment Insurance Agency wage data, and also there are a number of issues around institutional review board or IRB requirements that have to be met. So basically the real adjustment that we typically make here is that our evaluation, design, and implementation needs to be adjusted in order to take account of these kinds of issues. One example of how we've dealt with exit data issues is that we've worked with the program coordinators on site, for example, in our Alabama and Florida program, to basically be able to follow student progress as they move through the program on a regular basis, and have periodic follow-ups with the program coordinator in order to track when students are actually exiting the program, so that we know in relatively real time when students are departing the program, and to be able to field exit surveys remotely using mobile technology, to being able to email links to exit surveys to students, and have follow-up information like cell phone information to be able to recontact them. Those are some of the ways we've tried to deal with that issue. Why don't we go to the next slide? Another kind of comparison that another kind of challenge that I mentioned earlier is this issue about being able to obtain valid comparison student data, to being able to actually have good data to construct comparison groups. Sometimes it's not unusual for there to be big challenges in terms of identifying concurrent comparison group data. So data on comparable students who are not participating in the grant-funded program. Usually our starting point is the assumption that we would like those, that'd be our preference, to have concurrent comparison group data for a number of reasons, one being that economic conditions change, and so there are other potential confounders like improvement in economic conditions that we've seen in recent years that might affect employment outcomes, for example, the likelihood of being employed, wage outcomes, and so forth. So ideally, we'd like to have concurrent comparison groups, but often that's not available. Often everybody who's a potential student to be included in the evaluation is actually in the grant-funded program at the time that it's being implemented. There have been some exceptions to that in our project, our TREND project in North Dakota. We're currently working with the colleges there to identify a concurrent comparison group. But in other cases, that's not been possible. For example, in our Alabama and Florida project. And there we had to rely on historical student data. We basically had to pull historical data for students who had attended the program in the years immediately prior to the implementation of the grant. The issue we faced there, unfortunately, though, was that the historical data in some cases turned out not to be as comprehensive as desired. The grant program, in effect, is improving the quality of data collection and institutional data records that are being kept on students. And so we end up with a situation where the historical data are not as complete as the new student data that are being collected on the participants in the grant-funded program. What we've dealt with there is basically the idea that our matches, our propensity score matches, may not be quite as robust as they would have been. But you're still able to do PSM analysis typically with a somewhat more limited data set. The issue becomes which data are missing and the degree of match that you're able to actually achieve statistically with the data that are available. So we'll go to the next slide and just talk about one other kind of challenge. And this is one that I think everybody faces, basically implementation challenges. One question that often arises is how fully defined, how operationally defined both the program itself and actually who counts as a participant in the program actually are. Another case from our Alabama and Florida project, AF10, basically the grant was funded in round 2, TAACCCT round 2. They got their initial funding in the fall of 2012, I believe. Basically, there was a ramp-up period. For a short period of time after the grant was awarded, the first semester, really there weren't any implementation activities happening at all. Then there was a period after that when there were some implementation activities going on, but they were pretty limited. The program was basically being slowly rolled out. And within the first year, by the end of the first year of the program, then it was at full speed. So basically, we had to make some decisions about defining who counted as a true participant and who counted as a potential comparison. We decided that students who were from years prior to the initiation of the grant, so a year that did not coincide with the grant, they would constitute legitimate comparison students, and we'd pull data on them to identify our comparison group, and that students who were participating when the program was fully up and running would count as program participants. And then basically what we've done is some additional analysis to take a look at the students who fell in between and then make a judgment call as to whether they had been exposed to sufficient program activities through our implementation evaluation, our measurement basically of the dosage or exposure to program activities, whether or not they actually would qualify as program participants. So basically, we needed to develop a set of operational definitions of what counted as the program fully functioning or maybe in development mode, and what counted as an actual program participant. And these factors were taken into account. We didn't have this built into our original design, but we made some adjustments to our design to account for these facts of life, basically on the ground as the program was being developed and then implemented. So I think I'll stop there. That's my last slide, and I'm going to turn it back to Dudney, I think, now. And here's just a slide summarizing PTB's contact information. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Doug. Just wanted to let you know, because we've gotten some good questions so far in the chat box. Let's hold on to those. We're going to hear from Dr. Heath Prince at the University of Texas Ray Marshall Center now, and then we'll take questions related to both presentations when he wraps up. Heath?
Hi, Randy. Thanks. Hi, this is Heath Prince. I am the director of the Ray Marshall Center, as Randy said. For those of you who don't know much about us, we have been around for 43 years. We were founded by Ray Marshall, President Carter's labor secretary, and we are essentially a research and evaluation shop focusing on human capital development writ large, everything from early childhood education to post-secondary to workforce development to K-12. We do much of our research using large administrative record data, and we have several TAACCCT grants currently, and I'll talk about those. Oh, I see the slides already up. Good. Like Doug and Paul, we have also evaluated, we are currently evaluating actually a trend grant. I think it's a round 2 TAACCCT grant. We are also evaluating the Gulf Coast IT Consortium, which is a consortium of 9 community colleges in Louisiana and Mississippi. We're also working with Tulsa Community College on their TAACCCT grant. We've just recently started working with the Greater Memphis Alliance for a Competitive Workforce, which is another consortium that is around 4, and we're also working with Austin Community College on their evaluation as part of their TAACCCT grant with NOVA. Okay, next slide, Dudley. So we like to take the approach with our evaluations of really beginning a common denominator across all of our evaluations, not just our TAACCCT evaluations, but in nearly all of the evaluations that we do. We'd like to include a formative component to our evaluations. And by that we mean that we, from the outset, we like to work closely with project leads. We like to engage them early on in the process and to get their input on the evaluation design, to generate buy-in and trust, and also to work with the IR staff at the colleges. That work typically involves assessing their capacity to collect the data that we need to do the evaluation that we need to do, and to work with them to build their capacity. We're finding that the level of understanding and capability at the college level varies fairly widely. And so we, in each of our TAACCCT grants, we work very closely with IR staff. We go in early on with a data dictionary and we ask, is this the data that you collect? Is this the data that you can collect? And we explain to them why it's important that we have that data. And it's primarily to do with our impact evaluations. Like Paul and Doug, we tend not to do random assignment for a number of reasons, all of which I think Doug covered very well. And we do tend to rely on quasi-experimental designs, usually propensity score matching, but we are flexible about that. It is often the case that we go in with a design like propensity score matching, and we find that we're not going to be able to get the data that we need to do that kind of evaluation. And so we start looking along the rigor spectrum to find the most rigorous evaluation that we can do, given the data that we can get. And I think so much of, and I'm sure you guys are familiar with this, I mean, so much of what we can do is really constrained by the availability of the data and the regular availability of the data. We do need to collect it fairly regularly. And so it's not enough that a college can report to us data every now and then, or data on some of the elements and not on all of the elements. We do really need to have data reported to us consistently on really, there's a minimum number of indicators that we need in order to conduct a good evaluation. So we go in with something as rigorous as we can, but once we understand what the data situation is, then we look for other methods. Currently, we are conducting two of our evaluations using differences in differences, and we're finding that is working out a bit better. At a minimum, we will do an outcomes evaluation, but we typically include that in the range of services, if you will, that we provide when we do an evaluation. We prefer not to do only an outcomes evaluation, but in at least one case, it is moving in that direction where we simply are not going to be able to get a good comparison group. So we are thinking about doing just an outcomes evaluation, but obviously that's not desirable. Okay, next slide. So I think Doug covered quite a few of these. Some of the bigger hurdles that we're looking at, and these aren't in any particular order, but I would put accessing UI wage data at the top of any list that I could come up with in terms of ranking them in terms of difficulty. At the Ray Marshall Center, we sit on top of all of the UI wage data for the state. So we have easy access to that data, and when it comes to evaluating and doing an impact evaluation for any program in the state, it's an easy thing for us to do. It is not an easy thing to do if we're talking about evaluating impact of a program in most other states. It's an uphill battle, as I'm sure you all know, but it is one that we are having some success in fighting, but certainly not. It's certainly not easy. Another hurdle that I alluded to earlier is this limited capacity at the college level to collect and report the data that we need. It's almost always the case that the colleges are very willing to collect data on participants. They're even willing to collect additional data that they don't normally collect on participants. But when it comes to collecting data, that data on a comparison group, and we really do need similar data for both the participant and the comparison group, when it comes to collecting data on non-participants, that takes a lot more convincing, as I'm sure you would imagine or probably have experienced yourselves, than collecting data just on participants. This is probably beyond the scope of this presentation, but I've made this point in other presentations, and I'll make it here again, that I think that there is a huge disconnect between the demands for rigor from the department and the ability and willingness or willingness on the part of colleges and state agencies to provide that data. It has been heartening if you've been evaluating programs or working with programs as long as I have to see language about rigor moving into RFAs and RFPs coming out of the Department of Labor. It was not the case 15 years ago. It certainly is the case now, and that's a great thing. We all want to know what's working and what's not working, and we all know the best way to figure that out. It's not anecdote, and it's probably not outcomes, but we do need to conduct an experiment. So that's all well and good. and it's great that the department is pushing that language down into their RFPs and their RFAs. However, when it comes to local capacity to collect and report on data at that level, that's another story. There's a lot of capacity development, I think, that needs to take place. And, you know, even not so much capacity development at the state level, but a lot of moral suasion, if you will, at the state level. As you know, getting UI wage data is the state's property. It's not the Fed's property. So getting them to release that to researchers is proving inordinately difficult in a number of our evaluations. So that is a big hurdle that I think we could probably discuss at greater length during the Q&A. Smaller hurdles, things like attrition in a growing economy, like is the case in several of the states where we're working. We find that our participants are getting hired out of the programs before they complete the courses, which is great for them. From an evaluator's perspective, it kind of messes things up a little bit, but that's great. That's a good problem to have. And as I suggested earlier, you know, there are difficulties associated with randomly assigning students, particularly when you're talking about students in courses that they need in order to get a job. I think we're all, well, I shouldn't assume that we're all on the same page in that regard, but it's a difficult thing to do for a number of reasons, and one that we tend to avoid, at least at the Ray Marshall Center. Next slide. So those were all of the, not all, but most of the more significant hurdles that we tend to face when we conduct any evaluation, but I found that it's particularly true with the TAACCCT evaluations. So that has led to a number of workarounds, a number of solutions that are proving more or less effective in addressing some of those hurdles. In each of the evaluations that we're conducting, we have created data sharing agreements. And this really helps with the FERPA issues that tend to crop up. In these data sharing agreements with the colleges, we outline our own history of dealing with student unit record. We outline our own history of working with large administrative data sets and our ability at the center to protect that data. We create these data sharing agreements with colleges. We negotiate them with the colleges, and we put them into place. They are in the form of memoranda. So they're not ironclad, but it certainly helps allay a lot of concerns about handing over student data. It's not perfect, but it's very helpful. I think I went into some detail about what we think of when we think of a formative evaluation. We try to include that in each one of our evaluations. I should also say that we prefer to do, as Doug and Paul do, mixed methods evaluations. It just so happens that in each one of our TAACCCT grants, we are partnering with another research organization or other research organizations to do the qualitative piece, the implementation evaluation, and we're focusing on the quantitative piece. But in each one, we are also building into it this formative evaluation component, and that is largely to address a couple of things. Concern on the part of the project leads, normal human concerns about being evaluated, frankly, and also the issue of capacity development at the college level, like I mentioned. Thirdly, data intermediaries. In a couple of cases, we are working with third, fourth, fifth. I'm not sure which kind of party, but let's call them a third party that handles all of the data. They handle the collecting of the data, the cleaning of the data, and in both of these cases, well, in one is under development as we speak. These organizations are like us, like the Ray Marshall Center. They're university-based research organizations that have a long history of working with their state departments of labor to work with UI wage data. So not only are they collecting the data and cleaning the data, but in one case, and we hope in another case, they're also matching the student unit records to the UI records. So that is helping us to get around this issue, not to get around, but helping us to address the difficulty of getting UI wage data to actually measure impact once an individual enters the labor market. If none of that seems to be working out, we are working with post-program surveys. That's stretching it a bit. We are thinking about developing post-program follow-up surveys. We know that in one case, one of the colleges in the consortium of colleges has already done this, and they've produced a great template that we're trying to share with the other colleges and to encourage them to use that survey to follow up with participants. And that still doesn't address the need for data on the comparison group. And that's, frankly, a really difficult nut to crack, and we're still, any ideas out there, we'd be happy to hear them. And I think all of these things, and everything that I've said over the last 10 minutes, speaks to the importance of flexibility in design. For every one of you who has gone through the work of creating an evaluation plan that you want to put into a proposal, or even an evaluation plan once you've gotten a grant, you go in with your best guess as to what you can do. But once the program gets started, it is ideal that as evaluators, we're involved at the beginning, at the very beginning, in terms of program design and implementation. That has its downsides too, in that you invest a lot of time and effort to create an evaluation plan for the department based on what you know at the time, but once the program gets up and running, you realize that changes will need to be made. So it's important to go into it thinking this may or may not work, and if it doesn't, what's our plan B or C, or how flexible are we in terms of modifying what we thought we were going to do. I think that's all I have, actually. I'll stop there, and I'll turn it back over to Brandy. Oh, and my contact information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Heath, and thank you, Paul and Doug. I think one thing that is a virtue of this discussion so far is that we've heard not only about the hurdles to evaluation, implementing your evaluation, but also a lot of very constructive and rich suggestions for solutions to these issues. I want to throw out some of the questions that we've received from listeners, from participants in the webinar to both of our presenters. And the first one is for you to address FERPA issues. How are you addressing FERPA when it comes up as a hurdle to obtaining student unit record level data?
I'll start. A couple of years ago, we were really butting heads with a number of our grantors regarding FERPA, and we knew that that the rules had changed, that there was more flexibility written into the rules regarding having data available to researchers. but it seemed like in response to that greater flexibility, states took that opportunity to make access to data even more restrictive than it had been. So we held a conference here in Austin, and we invited everyone who was interested in coming to talk about what other states were doing, how other states were taking advantage of greater flexibility in FERPA with regards to accessing it for research, and what the benefits of that greater flexibility were in terms of program improvement, in terms of, say, generating additional funding for programs that were successful, in terms of policymaking. And it was a rich discussion. There were a lot of great examples. Florida, as you might expect, is doing great stuff. I want to say Ohio or Washington State also doing great stuff. They presented. All of that led up to us refining our existing data sharing agreements in such a way that made it clear that the regulations allowed for greater flexibility, and here's what that greater flexibility could mean in terms of us evaluating your program. So there isn't a silver bullet, but it does take a bit of persuading that we are acting within the guidelines of the regulations, and there are benefits to allowing us access to that data, and hoping that they agree. That's the best I can do.
Right. Paul or Doug, do you have anything you want to add to that? I know this is an issue that comes up a lot, and it varies in interpretation from state to state. So there's probably no one-size-fits-all answer.
No, absolutely. This is Doug Evans. That was the main thing I was going to say, is that there is a lot of variation in terms of state-by-state perspectives on this, and we've had success with getting those data in our evaluations so far. We have, in our most recent interactions, planning for the two round 4 evaluations that we're in the midst of right now, had some pretty intense discussions around these issues with the clients. These are two different, locations than we've been working in the past at 2 different states. And yeah, I mean, they've raised a lot of concerns, but I think the main thing that we've done is just had very careful discussions around the benefits for the evaluation of us being able to, basically what we would be able to do and not able to do, right, comparing those 2 scenarios in the presence or absence of having access to those student data. There are a lot of things we simply would not be able to do. And so I think having those frank discussions about what is the evaluation really going to be able to accomplish or not in the presence or absence of those data, to me, having those good, frank discussions up front is really the best way to go.
Okay. Another question that's come up, particularly in relation to working with the institutional research staff, is what do you do when you're struggling to get direct access to IR as opposed to simply informing your project leader about it? Are there any suggestions about how to encourage access from project leadership to institutional research people in the college or consortium?
I'll just start by saying that, in general, I think I mentioned this, alluded to this earlier when I was presenting, that we view these relationships with the colleges as a partnership. We're not evaluating them. This is a partnership to evaluate a program, and we're both contributors to this process in different ways. And establishing a good relationship with the project director on the college's end, and then just establishing some clear ground rules for how we'll work with the institutional research office, and frankly that has varied from one project to the next. In some cases we're working with them more directly, and those folks are involved in the meetings and front and center. In other cases it's we're working through the program staff to get to the IR folks. So.
Okay. Heath, anything to add on that?
No, that's pretty much what we do too.
Sure. I'm going to pose a question from an audience member, and I hope that I get this right to either of you. It's really more a question of methodology than program or data access. How do you address strongly ignorable treatment assignment as an assumption of propensity score matching, as well as stable unit treatment assignment? I'm not sure if that, if I translated that appropriately, but can you tackle that?
Doug, I will toss it to you. I'm going to mull that one over for a bit.
Yeah, I don't, we haven't, I guess to be perfectly honest with you, we haven't really had to grapple with that issue, so I don't really have a lot that I can say about that at the moment. I mean, those are good questions. It depends obviously on the nature of the data that you're dealing with and the nature of the intervention, but that's not something we've had to really deal with so far.
No, same here. You know, I can't add much to that other than to say not for TAACCCT, but this is not well, but for our Workforce Innovation Fund evaluation. It has been really helpful. It was painful, but it was helpful for us to go back and forth with the NEC, the National Evaluation Consultant or whatever. I think it's apt associate. We went back and forth with them on a number, not a large number, but a small, significant number of questions they had about our initial evaluation design. And through that process, it really helped us to come up with a design that we felt very confident was a rigorous design and addressed most any potential issue that might come up in the evaluation. So I can't speak directly to the question, but if that were to come up in any of our current TAACCCT evaluations, I think I would want to follow the same process and go back and forth with other people who are dealing with the same sorts of issues with regards to propensity score matching or any other matching design, and among us evaluators, see if we could come up with something that is defensible and implementable.
Okay. We have another question. Has either team, evaluated a project where finding an appropriate comparison group is complicated because the initiative, the intervention is brand new to the college? And what did you do in response?
You mean in the sense that, so there, let's say, the college simply had no welding program of any kind previously, and now they get a grant a TAACCCT grant to implement a welding program. Is that sort of the idea?
I think that's a good example, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple ways you can go there. One is that there may be programs that are not identical, that the credential that's being received or the training that's being received is not identical, but it's highly similar. And the population of students that's being drawn from is quite similar. That's one potential solution. It is true that in some of our projects, our consortium projects, there's diversity among the colleges in terms of who has implemented what previously. And so there have been cases where we've had to essentially say, okay, we're going to use, the colleges that do have some prior history or do have a comparable program as a source of comparison data, and other colleges will not be included in that process. So that's another kind of move on the rigor spectrum, I think, as it was put earlier, that one can potentially make. So those are a couple possibilities.
Okay. Heath, do you have anything to add on that score?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of one of our evaluations now, and you know, it's not that it's an entirely new program in the sense that, as Doug was just saying, it's not like they've never had a welding program before, but they've never had a welding program that was part of a career pathway that also had with it support services. So in that sense, it is a new program, but it's different from previous welding programs that did not have those other components to it. So the comparison would be between participants in that program and participants in, for lack of a better term, you know, the run-of-the-mill welding program. And we would look for participants that, you know, were similar on a wide range of characteristics, as you would do in any sort of matching design. But what we're testing is whether or not the addition of these other factors makes a difference in terms of an individual's labor market outcomes. That's in addition to what Doug said. I think you might want to think of that too.
Okay. Well, thank you, Heath. And we've come to the end pretty much of questions from the audience. I want to thank everybody, particularly Heath and Paul and Doug, for presenting and responding to questions today. I want to just give you in the audience a little heads up. There'll be a resource opening up soon developed by Apt Associates to house information and resources and webinar recordings and whatnot across all of the TAACCCT grants. And you'll be notified from an email, by an email when this goes live. In the meantime, we will be posting this recording and other webinar and evaluation resources at the SharePoint site. And you can email, if you don't have access now to the SharePoint site, you can get the password and access instructions by emailing TAACCCT at TAACCCT@urban.org and provide your name, email, and the grant round that you're working on, and they'll help you out. So from Boston, this is Randy Wilson with Dudney Silla signing off. We'll be back to you in a few months with another webinar for the TAACCCT evaluation community. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for future topics, feel free to email either Randy or myself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi.